Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invite and thanks for tuning in this morning. So this is joint work with Nina, who is here as well. The title is Local Evidence and Diversity in Minipublics. So this paper is motivated by a recent democratic innovation that goes by the name of Minipublics or citizen assemblies, or sometimes called also citizen juries or conventions. In particular, we'll be studying the optimal composition of these mini-publics in the presence of political uncertainty. Now, the basic idea of a mini-public goes back to Robert Dahl in the 80s. Dahl was a political scientist who first conceptualized this particular institution. So Dahl envisioned mini-publics to be, as you can see from this quote as well, he envisioned mini-publics to be an assembly of ordinary citizens who are selected to be demographically representative of the large population, but small relative to the entire population, whose job is to deliberate for an extended amount of time on an issue of public interest, articulate recommendations that then will be transmitted to a policymaker, or to some other decision maker. So this is our starting point. The premise for this particular institution or mechanism is that in large and diverse modern societies, public policy making is complex, and often it has to rely on information that's not readily available and that can only be accessed by lay citizens. Now, as we know from the classic result of rational ignorance in political economy, lay citizens have very weak incentives to be acquiring information about public policies, because typically when they go to the ballot box, the acquisition of that information is costly, and the probability of them being pivotal in the voting institutions is quite small. So Minipublics is a particular suggestion of getting out of this rational ignorance point. The mini-public is sufficiently small to strengthen the incentives for information acquisition, while hopefully also sufficiently representative of the large population, so as to make a decision that would reflect what the entire population would choose if it was informed. Okay, so the question that then arises and is at the center of our paper is which social groups should be represented in a mini-public. Okay, so let me give you a very high introduction on the particular model that we have in mind and the abstract features that would like this model to have. So I'd like you to think of the citizenry as a sequence of citizens lined up from left to right in a particular way, so as to reflect some characteristic that is important for the mini-public that will be formed. For instance, you might want to think of these citizens as lined up according to the income distribution, from the poorest to the left to the richest to the right. A mini-public in our world is a particular selection of citizens. So in this illustration here, I'm not sure if you see my cursor. In this illustration here, the filled black dots would be mini-public citizens who've been invited into the mini-public. And then subsequently, mini-public citizens see who else is into the mini-public, and then they decide whether to acquire information about the public policy. So the red filled dots here would be mini-public citizens who decide to acquire information. So in our paper, we look at a setting in which mini-public citizens are producing evidence for a policymaker. Each citizen will be able to produce local evidence about this public policy, but it's up to that citizen to decide whether to produce that evidence. Crucially, local evidence will be correlated across citizens. So the evidence that the 50th percentile citizen can bring into the table is correlated with that the 70th percentile citizen can bring to the table. Then this evidence will be transmitted to a policymaker who will make a policy decision based on the produced evidence. And crucially for our story, the mini-public will face uncertainty about the threshold that will be used in the policymaker's decision. So let me, now that I've presented things in the abstract, let me give you a particular example that we have in mind. So mini-publics have been recently used across Europe to address climate policy. You might already be familiar with this, but a particular mini-public that was quite in the focus of the media in the last 2 years was the Citizens' Climate Convention in France. Okay, so this convention was composed of 150 ordinary citizens, representative of the large French society. The criteria that were used for targeting citizens for the Citizens Convention were basically 6: gender, age, education, occupation, residence, and geographical area. There were other criteria that there was quite a bit of public debate on whether they should have been used, but they were ultimately not used. Okay, so this particular mini-public was gathered in October of 2019, and it continued operating until June of 2020, when it issued 149 recommendations and presented these recommendations to the President Macron, who was the one to have established the mini-public in the first place. This particular mini-public had an advisory role, so these recommendations were communicated to President Macron, but President Macron had to take action on them. We like this particular quote that reflects the fact that the citizens who were invited into the mini-public were not experts on climate policy. They were rather ordinary citizens who, as this quote reflects, were supposed to bring their own daily expertise and the diversity of their profiles into climate policy. Now, the issue that we'd like to focus on this story is the political uncertainty that accompanied the convention throughout its proceedings, and that we argue is a general feature of mini-publics more generally as well. So initially, President Macron pledged to forward the recommendations without filter to either the National Assembly or to a popular referendum. But ultimately, what happened was that only a small portion of these recommendations were accepted by the government without major changes. 37% were modified or watered down, and about 53% of the recommendations were rejected. Okay, so as you can imagine, the Citizens' Convention was quite unhappy about this. There was a subsequent gathering of the 150 citizens in which they decided to rate Macron's responsiveness to their recommendations, and they assigned Macron a score of 3.5 out of 10. Okay, so they deemed the response to be quite weak. Now, in this paper, we look at the link between how impactful the recommendations of the mini-public are, so how responsive will the policymaker be to these recommendations, and how representative the mini-public is. Okay, so this is the particular link that we're investigating. And in particular, we look at we look at two separate questions that work towards examining this link. So first, we focus on evidence production, and we try to understand how does political uncertainty affect the citizens' incentive to contribute their local evidence into the mini-public. Then once we've examined the evidence production incentives, we take these incentives to study mini-public design. So the question there is, to what degree can we hope that the optimal mini-public is representative of the large citizenry, taking these endogenous incentives into account? Okay. So let me give you a very sort of brief list of takeaways from this paper, and hopefully by the end of the talk, this will be a bit clearer. In this paper, we are making the claim that political uncertainty can be detrimental to the production of evidence in mini-publics. And this is the case even under circumstances in which we should expect more rather than less evidence production. So in our model, we are in a sense stacking the chances in favor of more evidence production by first assuming that the policymaker and the citizens agree ex ante on the decision threshold. So there is no ex ante disagreement about the threshold that's to be used. Second, by assuming that the citizens are civic-minded and they focus on the common good. And third, by assuming that evidence is costless. So citizens can discover evidence at zero cost. Okay. So political uncertainty is a real issue. And then we try to understand the determinants of such distortions in the mini-public. So we show that political uncertainty, while it can be a real issue, it's an issue when it's moderate political uncertainty rather than very high or very low political uncertainty. We also show that the distortions that we identify are more serious in smaller mini-publics, in circumstances in which the policy sentiment is stronger and when the citizenry is more heterogeneous. Okay, the optimal mini-public will be of inefficiently low diversity. Now, in order for us to establish this, we have to conceptualize two notions of diversity. We put forth two notions, informational diversity and demographic diversity, and we argue that the optimal mini-public, whenever it's distorted away from the first best, it's too non-diverse according to both of these notions. So let me stop here and see if there are any questions, but if not, I'll transition to the model. Okay, so onto the model we go. So in this setup, we'll have a single policymaker and a unit mass of citizens. The citizens here will be denoted by I, where I is in the unit interval. A mini-public is defined to be a finite selection of distinct citizens from this unit interval. So we're denoting a mini-public by boldface M, and the citizens in it by I1 through IK. They're ordered from left to right. So as in this particular illustration that we have here, we have the unit continuum of citizens, and then I1, I2, and I3 are the citizens in a three-citizen mini-public. In terms of the number of citizens or the constraint on the policymaker on how large of a mini-public she can put together, we assume that the mini-public can accommodate at most n citizens. We'll refer to n as mini-public capacity, and M sub n will be the set of all mini-publics that satisfy this constraint. So all mini-publics of at most n citizens will be into M sub n. So let me describe the policy, and this is really where the novelty of the model lies. So there is an uncertain policy that's available for adoption. And this policy has heterogeneous outcomes across the citizenry. We'll capture these heterogeneous outcomes through outcome mapping beta, which maps the unit continuum to R. So each particular citizen in the unit continuum will be assigned a real value, the outcome from the policy, which can be either positive or negative. So beta I will be the realized policy outcome for citizen I. Okay. So in our framework, we want to not introduce any differences in uncertainty across citizens. So we assume that each outcome has unit variance. So in terms of the outcome that each citizen can bring to the mini-public, each outcome has the same, carries the same uncertainty. The second feature that we would like to have is correlation between citizens. So we assume that for any two citizens I and J, their outcomes beta I and beta J are correlated. And crucially for us, this correlation decreases with distance. So going back to the example that I gave with income distribution, the further away two citizens are in the income distribution, the more weakly correlated their outcomes are. Okay, so actually, let me go briefly through this figure here. So I want you to think of the citizens in the x-axis and policy outcomes in the y-axis, and then some policy mapping that's being realized that maps each citizen into the particular policy. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the structure of this policy mapping. The outcome mapping beta is drawn from the sample paths of a Nornstein-Uhlenbeck process on 0,1, where for any two citizens I and J, we have two properties. These are the properties that I just introduced informally. So first, we have that beta I is distributed normally with unit variance and some mean beta bar I, which for the moment, we could just set to 0 for the sake of interpretation. And secondly, the correlation between the outcomes of the two citizens, beta I and beta j, is given by this exponential. Okay? So in this exponential, I'd like you to notice two things. So first, it's the e to the minus the distance between the two citizens. So the greater the distance between the two citizens, the weaker the correlation is. And secondly, and conveniently for us, there is a parameter here, L, that captures the extent to which the strength of the correlation, or the extent to which any two citizens within a fixed distance are correlated. Okay, so this is a particular modeling choice that we make to introduce correlation between citizens, and it gives us the two properties that are desirable in our framework. So going back to this picture here, now I told you that you could think of beta bar as 0, but more generally, you can think of beta bar as either a constant or something that varies across citizens that determines the expected outcome across different citizens. As we'll see, this particular parameter will enter our model in a very simple way. Now, in terms of the parameter L that captures the degree of correlation between any two citizens, we'd like to interpret this as a parameter of heterogeneity. As L is going to plus infinity, the outcomes of any two citizens in this society will be almost perfectly correlated. So in a sense, this is a society or citizenry in which the outcomes are almost the same. So the degree of homogeneity is very high. To the other side of the spectrum, as L goes to 0, the outcomes for any given distance of citizens become almost independent. Okay? So this corresponds to a very heterogeneous society. So the outcomes of any, it's very hard to predict the outcome of a citizen from citizens that are nearby to that citizen. Okay, so let me describe the payoff now, payoffs of the two players now. So both the policymaker and the mini-public citizens in this context will care about the average outcome of the policy. So this is the sufficient statistic that they both care about. What is the average outcome of the policy here? Well, it's the realized outcome for each citizen aggregated across citizens. We denote this by B. So B is the sufficient statistic of the policy that all players care about. Now, because we're here in a Gaussian setting, this B is normally distributed with some prior mean, which is essentially just the aggregation of the expected outcome for each citizen across all citizens, and some variance, some prior variance that we can unpack in terms of the heterogeneity of the citizenry. But I'm not writing here for easier exposition. Okay. So we want to think of this B as capturing the common good. So this is the true value of the policy that everyone in this society cares about. Now, each mini-public citizen will obtain B from the adoption of the policy and 0 otherwise, whereas the policymaker will obtain the same B minus C, a term that we'll refer to as the threshold of adoption. So this is the payoff from adoption, the ex post payoff from adoption. If the policy is not adopted, the payoff for the policymaker will be 0 as well. Now, this threshold of adoption, C, is a very important parameter for us because it captures the extent of political uncertainty. So let me flesh this out a little bit carefully. This threshold of adoption, we assume, is normally distributed with mean 0 and variance tau squared. So in terms of the mean, we're assuming that the expected C is 0. So ex ante, the policymaker follows the same threshold of adoption as the citizens. Okay, so the expectation of this term with respect to C is just B. The second term here, tau squared, captures how variable or unpredictable C is. So the more variable C is, the harder it's to predict the threshold that the policymaker will follow. We interpret this as higher political uncertainty. So tau squared, or more generally tau, is the parameter that I'll refer to as capturing political uncertainty. C will be realized after evidence discovery, but before the adoption decision. Okay, so this is what introduces the friction in our framework. The absolute value of B bar is what we refer to in the paper as the policy sentiment. I won't talk much about this today, but we won't. We have quite an extensive discussion in the paper of how the policy sentiment affects distortions. So the timing is the following. First, the outcome mapping is realized. Then the policymaker will choose a mini-public. So let me describe this first stage, the mini-public choice. So the policymaker will choose essentially a lottery over feasible mini-publics. Remember that the constraint on a mini-public is that they have to have at most n citizens. Once a mini-public is realized from this lottery, each citizen in that mini-public will observe the entire realized mini-public. So this is the first stage, policymaker's choice. The second stage will be evidence discovery. So once a mini-public is realized from the lottery that the policymaker chose, each citizen in this mini-public can costlessly and publicly discover their own outcome. Okay, so two things are important here. First, the citizen discovers things publicly, so they do not know beta ex ante, but they can discover that for everyone to see. And secondly, there is a zero cost of such discovery. All evidence discovery will be simultaneous and will refer to the citizens who discover their outcome as active and the ones who do not as passive. Okay? So there will be a subset of citizens who will decide to become active, and beta of m hat will be observed. Okay. Now, all this evidence that's been accumulated in the second stage will be transferred to the policymaker. So we enter the third stage, what we call policy adoption. In this stage, the policymaker will observe not only the accumulated evidence, but also the realized threshold of adoption C. And with these two components, she'll decide whether to adopt the policy or take the status quo, which, as I said before, gives a payoff of 0 to everyone. So let us put all of this together. So we've got citizens and the policy outcome mapping in gray. In this particular figure, we're showing a mini-public of 3 citizens, I1, I2, and I3, who've been invited into the mini-public. However, only 2 of them will decide to become active, I1 and I2. Their policy outcomes will be observed. So these are the red dots here. The policymaker will observe only these 2 outcomes for I1 and I2 and will extrapolate about the rest of the outcomes from these 2 outcomes. So the red dashed line here depicts that extrapolation. And we'll have to make a decision based on this extrapolated mapping. Okay. So this is the model. Now, let me say a few words about why this model is the right model for mini-publics. So there are 4 features of mini-publics that would like for a model of mini-publics to have, and we think that this model has all these 4 features. So first, the mini-public is a microcosm of the larger citizenry. Even though we have a unit continuum of citizens, and the mini-public is just a finite selection, so measure 0 of citizens in this setting, it is still the case that the mini-public is informative about the effects of the policy across the population. Okay. The second feature that this model has is, or reflects, is the targeted recruitment of mini-public citizens. So the citizens in this mini-public are targeted by the policymaker. They're not elected or self-selected into the mini-public. The third feature is the fact that the mini-public has no decisional authority in this framework. It only has an advisory role. And indeed, this is the main friction in this model. The mini-public has the capacity to produce evidence, but does not have the authority to make a decision based on that evidence. So there will be uncertainty about the impact of the mini-public on policymaking ex post. And the fourth feature is that we're here modeling mini-publics as a mechanism for producing public evidence about novel policies, rather than as a mechanism for aggregating existing private information that the citizens might hold. Okay, so we are focusing on the evidence production aspect of things. I will skip the related literature in the interest of time, but I'm always happy to come back to this at any point during the talk if there are questions. So let me see if there are any questions before I move on to simplifying the policymaker's problem.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat Nina answered, but I also have 2 questions, and maybe after that other have questions. So you mentioned that the mini-publics represent certain groups of citizens. Why do you assume that I'm, as a representative of a mini-public, care about the whole population and not just about kind of the group I'm representing, and or how does it matter? And the second question would be about the timing of your model. Why does this threshold C realize after evidence collection?
Thank you. So both are very important questions. On the first question, so there are a few reasons why we make this modeling choice, which is that all citizens care about the average outcome of the policy, which is the same statistic that the policymaker cares as well. So first, we think that it's a good first order approximation of the recommendation that mini-public citizens are given when they come into the mini-public. They are given the suggestion to be thinking about the common good when they deliberate. Of course, there is a question of the extent to which they actually do that, but we want to give the best chance to that story that the mini-public organizers are actually intending to. The second reason is that we want to abstract away from heterogeneity in preferences. We're actually currently thinking about ways of extending the model in that direction as well. But the baseline model is assuming away heterogeneity in preferences and actually focusing on heterogeneity in evidence. So this is a game of global preferences, if you'd like, and local access to evidence. And that's the aspect that we'd like to focus on. So these are sort of the 2 reasons why we've made this choice, and it allows us to focus on aspects that we think are important. But of course, the heterogeneity in preferences is another important aspect that we leave out of this. The second question about timing is actually very important. So we are here assuming that C is realized after the evidence is produced in the mini-public. The alternative, of course, would be to introduce that before the evidence is produced, or perhaps in the process. So perhaps some evidence has been collected and other has not. On the positive side, we actually think that this is what happened in the Citizens' Convention in France, and what happens in many other mini-publics that see this friction. There is good evidence that Macron changed his attitude towards the recommendations after these recommendations were produced, and likely because the pandemic happened in the meantime, and there were lobbying forces on all sides that got realized after the evidence was produced. On the second reason is, of course, that we want to focus on the friction that comes from loss of agency by the citizens. And this is one way of modeling that loss of agency. If the threshold was realized before the evidence is produced, of course, there would be other choices that the citizens would make, knowing the amount of friction. Now, another thing that I want to mention, and perhaps I'll address this later if there are questions, is that a similar friction to the one that we have here would arise also if, on top of the political uncertainty, we also had a bias of the policymaker. So if the political uncertainty would be 0 in that case, the bias would be the one driving the friction between the citizens and the policymaker. And we have a similar force in that alternative model as well. So, so you could think of a similar friction arising even in the absence of this uncertainty about C. Thank you for the question. So any other questions?
maybe can I just ask sort of about the positive correlation? So am I correct that this rules out something like redistribution, where what is good is for the poor is bad for the rich, and sort of these sort of things?
That's a great question. So yes, I think I'm sympathetic to that interpretation, that this is this might not be capturing some sort of zero-sum sort of dynamics between different parts of the citizenry. So in that sense, yes, the positive correlation is important for what we'll have to say later on demographic diversity, and perhaps with negative correlation, other dynamics would play out. However, for much of what I'll be saying in terms of the friction, the particular correlation will not be important. It will be the Gaussian structure that is most important. So in that sense, much of the nature of the friction does not depend on the particular direction of the correlation. Does that answer your question? Okay, I cannot actually see the faces of the but I'll move on if there are no other questions. Okay, so let's talk about the policymakers problem. So let's fix some particular mini-public M and the particular profile of evidence discovery strategies for the citizens in this mini-public. So we'll denote these by delta I, where I is each citizen in the mini-public. Now, once we've fixed a mini-public and these strategies for the citizens, this will induce a lottery over active subsets of citizens in this mini-public. So we'll refer to these as active mini-publics. So this is a subset of citizens who are active, and formally we'll denote this by M hat. Okay. So once M hat is realized, then the outcomes that will become publicly observable is beta of M hat. So only the outcomes of these citizens, active citizens, will become observable. So the players, including the policymaker, will update their beliefs about the value of the policy from B bar, which remember is the prior value of the policy, to what we call a post-mini-public value, a posterior value for the policy, which we're denoting by B of M hat. This is the expectation of the average outcome of the policy given M hat and the outcomes that have been observed. Now, this post-mini-public value is also distributed according to a Gaussian distribution by Bayesian updating. The expectation of this post-mini-public value will have to be the prior value of the policy, but its variance will depend on the particular active mini-public that we're looking at. We denote this posterior variance by sigma squared M hat. So sigma squared M hat is an important object for us because it denotes how variable the post-mini-public value is, or alternatively, how informative this active mini-public M hat is. So the higher is the variance of the post-mini-public value, the greater is the uncertainty that has been resolved by the outcomes beta of M hat, and therefore the lower is the uncertainty that remains about the policy. Okay, so sigma squared of M hat is a sufficient statistic for how informative a mini-public is. Now, a key observation that we make in the paper is that the players' payoffs depend on M hat only through this posterior variance. So as long as we know how to write down this posterior variance, which in fact we do, and if there are questions, I can show you the particular expression for it. As long as we have that, we can proceed in writing down the payoffs of the players. So let's start with the policymaker first. So the policymaker will adopt the policy if and only if the post-mini-public value is above the realized threshold of adoption. So let's write the expected payoff of the policymaker given a particular informativeness of the mini-public as the probability that the post-mini-public value is above the threshold times the expectation of the ex-post payoff that the policymaker gets, the post-mini-public value minus the threshold of adoption, conditional on adoption. And here we're integrating over all the possible realized values of the threshold of adoption. Okay. So we can actually write down the expression of this payoff. And the important observation here is that the policymaker's expected payoff is strictly increasing in sigma squared. So the more informative the mini-public is, the better of the policymaker is. Now, hopefully this is straightforward. The policymaker's problem is essentially a problem of prediction. The policymaker is trying to best predict whether the true value of the policy, B, is above the realized threshold of adoption. Fixing any particular threshold of adoption, the higher is the informativeness of the mini-public, the better is the prediction. So the more accurate is the decision that the policymaker will take. Now, given that this is what happens for any given C, higher sigma squared, better prediction, this is the case also as we integrate over all possible C's. So a more informative mini-public will be preferred before C is realized as well. Okay? So the policymaker is only interested in maximizing informativeness. On the citizen side, things are a bit more complicated. So first of all, because all citizens care only about B, all citizens will have the same expected payoff from informativeness sigma squared. We do the same exercise for writing down the expected payoff of the citizen given the informativeness of the mini-public. The only difference here is that when we're taking the expectation conditional on adoption, the citizen does not benefit from C or does not consume C. The citizen only consumes the post-mini-public value. Okay, so this is the only difference in this expression. However, it's a substantial difference because we show that the citizen's expected payoff is not necessarily monotonic in informativeness of the mini-public. It's actually strictly quasi-convex in it. So it's strictly decreasing at first and then increasing with a minimum that we denote by sigma squared under bar, which is either 0, in which case it's strictly increasing everywhere, or it is an interior value that I'm about to depict in a picture as well. Okay? So if this particular minimum is at 0, as I just mentioned, there is the citizen's payoff is strictly increasing, so there is no conflict between the policymaker and the citizens. There is no interesting friction for us to look at here. The policymaker will be able to implement the most informative mini-public, but the citizen's payoff need not be increasing in such informativeness, so the citizen will not necessarily prefer to contribute his evidence to higher informativeness. So let me put all of this into a picture. So what we have in the x-axis here is mini-public informativeness, sigma squared. In the y-axis, we're depicting the citizen's payoff. And I'm here depicting the more interesting case in which the minimum is strictly above 0. Okay, so the citizen's payoff is first decreasing and then increasing. Now, for each citizen I in a given active mini-public M hat, the citizen looks at two particular levels of informativeness. First, she looks at the informativeness if she were to not contribute her evidence. So imagine that the citizen does not contribute the outcome, then the informativeness that would be generated in that case would be sigma squared of M hat minus I. Okay? We'll refer to this as passive informativeness of the citizen. If the citizen contributes the evidence, then the informativeness that is generated is sigma squared of M hat. So the marginal informativeness of a given citizen I is the difference between the active informativeness and the passive informativeness. And indeed, fixing M hat, the evidence discovery constraint here is that citizen I prefers to be active rather than to be passive. In terms of expected payoffs, the expected payoff of the active informativeness is higher than the expected payoff from this passive informativeness. So in this particular depiction here, I've shown a case in which the evidence discovery constraint is actually violated. The active informativeness is generates weakly lower payoff than the passive informativeness. Okay, so when do we actually see that this particular motive, the citizen being worried about the evidence that he generates, will dominate the citizen's calculus? Now, looking at the shape of this payoff, we can see here that there are two conditions that would make a citizen want to be passive. First of all, at 0, the payoff must be strictly decreasing. So there is a negative marginal value, strictly negative marginal value of information for very small amounts of information. So the minimum has to be to the right of 0. This captures the idea that a small amount of information harms the citizen. The second condition is, of course, that we need to be sufficiently to the left of this graph. So both the passive informativeness and the active informativeness should be sufficiently to the left relative to the minimum. Okay, so in this particular depiction here, we see that the only way for passive informativeness to be preferred is for both of these sufficient statistics to be to the left. Okay, we refer to this as both the active and the passive minipublic being sufficiently uninformative. So these are the two conditions that generate what we call in the paper the curse of too little information. The citizen does not want to generate their evidence if a small amount of information hurts, and both the information that can be generated with and without his presence is sufficiently small. Okay, so why is this friction? Well, becoming active has two potentially counteracting effects for the citizen. On the one hand, being active generates evidence. Evidence is good insofar as it will allow a more precise estimate of the value of the policy. So this suggests that information has value and the citizen cares about that value of information. But on the other hand, the information or the evidence that the citizen generates can potentially increase the probability of exposed misalignment between the policymaker and the citizen. The threshold of adoption might be realized at the level for which the citizens would prefer adoption and the policymaker would prefer rejection, or vice versa. Okay, so it's the trade-off between these two effects that the citizen takes into account. And as I just argued, the misuse of information dominates when the curse of too little information bites. Okay. We focus on a particular class of perfect Bayesian equilibria, the policymaker preferred equilibria, which is typically the approach that is taken in information design and mechanism design models. So we analyze the entire class of such equilibria, and we show that within this class, it's without loss to restrict attention to no randomization over minipublics. So the policymaker does not randomize over different minipublics. She just chooses a single minipublic. There is no mixing by the citizens in terms of being passive or active. So citizens within the minipublic take pure strategies at the evidence discovery stage. And third, there are no passive citizens in the minipublic. All citizens in the minipublic chosen by the policymaker are active. Okay, so these are without loss within the class of policymaker preferred perfect Bayesian equilibria. With this, we can now write the policymaker's minipublic choice problem in very simple terms. The policymaker maximizes the informativeness of the minipublic subject to evidence discovery constraints, meaning all citizens in the minipublic prefer their active informativeness to their passive informativeness. Of course, the first best minipublic here is the minipublic that is most informative. It's the minipublic that maximizes the informativeness sigma squared m, disregarding the evidence discovery constraints. In the paper, we take this particular solution to be the benchmark for the right level of diversity. The first best minipublic is the minipublic that would maximize the welfare of both the policymaker and the citizens in the absence of political uncertainty. We have a full characterization that comes from an earlier paper, but importantly for our purposes here, we show that in this first best minipublic, the citizens who become passive first, or who are more likely to be passive, are the peripheral citizens. Okay, so another way to say that is that the marginal informativeness of all the inner citizens in that first best minipublic is strictly smaller than that of the peripheral citizens. So the first best minipublic, whenever it's not attainable, is either one in which all citizens are passive, or is one in which the peripheral citizens are the ones that are passive. Okay, so in the remaining time, my plan is to go through the optimal mini-public. In particular, I will tell you something about the size of the optimal mini-public, the composition of the optimal mini-public, and how the distortions in the optimal mini-public will depend on political uncertainty. So let me see if there are any quick questions before I proceed. Okay, so let's go first to the size of the mini-public. So the question that we'd like to tackle first is whether the policymaker ever decides to sample fewer citizens than what the capacity allows. So will it ever be the case that the policymaker finds it optimal to sample fewer citizens than N? This proposition shows that fixing a capacity N, the optimal mini-public is either entirely empty, meaning that no mini-public is possible, or it consists of exactly N distinct citizens. So the argument for this is simple, and in fact, it relies on all that I've told you so far about the quasi-convexity of the citizens' payoff. Okay? So let's suppose, by contradiction, that the optimal mini-public is non-empty, so there is some citizen in it, but it consists of fewer citizens than N. So let's suppose that it consists of N prime citizens, strictly below N. Now let's consider adding a new citizen J to this mini-public. And let's see, obviously, the introduction of this new citizen will improve informativeness because this citizen is a new citizen into this mini-public. But let's see how that affects the evidence discovery constraints. Now, first of all, given that the original mini-public was active, that means that the informativeness of that mini-public was already on the increasing portion of this payoff function. So for the new citizen that was added to this mini-public, citizen J, the passive informativeness is the informativeness of the original mini-public. The new informativeness is the informativeness of M plus himself. And given that we're already in the increasing portion of the payoff, it must be that this new citizen wants to be active as well. Now let's consider the original citizens. The original citizens were active in the original mini-public. So that was by the premise that we already had an optimal mini-public. Now consider what the introduction of J does to the passive informativeness of these citizens. So for all original citizens, the passive informativeness increased with the introduction of J, and so did the active informativeness. So both the passive and the active informativeness of the original citizens moved further to the right. That means that if all the original citizens were active in the first place, now they're even more willing to be active in this new mini-public by the quasi-convexity of the payoff. Okay? So in the original mini-public, they're willing to go from here to here. In the new mini-public, they're of course willing to go from here to the higher informativeness here. That means that the optimal mini-public either will be entirely empty, so there will be no mini-public at all, or it will be of size n, but potentially distorted in its composition. Okay, so next, we'd like to address two questions. And this sort of reflects the structure of the paper as well, for those of you who will be going to the paper next. So first, we'd like to talk about the composition of a distorted mini-public. And secondly, would like to give an understanding of when is it that that each type of the optimal mini-public arises, first, best, distorted, or empty, given the parameters of this model. So we'd like to understand how the likelihood of having a distorted mini-public depends on political uncertainty, the size of the capacity of the mini-public, the sentiment about the policy, and the heterogeneity of the citizen. Okay, so for today's talk, I'm only going to get to political uncertainty on that. So let me talk about the composition. Okay. So there are two notions of diversity that we introduced in the paper in order to study the composition of the optimal mini-public. The first notion is informational diversity. Roughly speaking, informational diversity quantifies the novelty of the evidence that each citizen brings into the mini-public relative to the evidence that's generated by the rest of the mini-public. So formally, informational diversity for us is a notion of the marginal informativeness of each citizen normalized by the informativeness generated by everyone else. And we take the maximum with respect to all citizens because we want to look at the most novel citizens into the mini-public. Okay? So we'll look at the novelty of the evidence of the most novel citizens into the mini-public. And what we find is that for any given capacity, if the optimal mini-public is distorted in the sense that it's neither the empty one nor the first best, then it's strictly less informationally diverse than the first best mini-public. So the largest piece of novel evidence that's brought into the optimal mini-public is less novel than in the first best mini-public. So let me go back to this picture to briefly give the intuition for this. So as I told you, in the first best mini-public, the citizens who are most novel in the sense that they have the highest marginal informativeness are the peripheral citizens. Okay? And these would be the citizens that would not be willing to be active in the first best mini-public. Okay? Now, the only way for an optimal mini-public to induce all citizens to be active is for that optimal mini-public to suppress the marginal informativeness of the citizens in it. So in this picture here, we have the first best and some citizens not being willing to be active. The only way to get an optimal mini-public given n, which of course will have lower informativeness than the first best, is to actually suppress the marginal informativeness of all citizens, or another way to say that is to increase the passive informativeness of all those citizens. So to suppress the novelty that each citizen brings into the mini-public. Okay. Now the natural next question is, what does lower informational diversity imply for demographic diversity? Okay, and I'm going to give you the intuition for demographic diversity using a mini-public of size 2, for which the definition of demographic diversity is the distance between these two citizens. Okay. Now, let's suppose that the optimal mini-public is non-empty, but not the first best. Then we show that the unique optimal mini-public is the symmetric mini-public, so symmetric with respect to the median citizen 1/2, such that each citizen in the optimal mini-public is closer to 1/2 than the first best citizens. Moreover, we showed that the evidence discovery constraints have to bind for both these citizens. So in this depiction here, we have the first best citizens, IF1 and IF2, but the optimal citizens have to be closer to 1/2. The intuition for this is that because of the informational diversity result that I gave you before, would like to suppress the marginal informativeness of all of the two citizens in the optimal mini-public. And the only way to do that in this framework with two citizens is to bring them closer together. Okay. So given time, I'm going to skip the intuition, rather the proof for this result, except that I'd like to sort of summarize once again briefly what this means for us, and then I can come back to the proof if there are questions at the end. So the problem with attaining the first best is that the first best is too diverse to incentivize the citizens to discover evidence. So the citizens are too far from each other to be willing to find evidence. So we have to bring I1 star and I2 star closer to the median citizen, which of course means that the citizens close to the median citizen will be overrepresented. Okay. Another way to say this is that in this distorted optimal mini-public, the outcomes of the two citizens in the mini-public will be more strongly correlated, and therefore the mini-public will carry more redundant evidence into it. Now, we are currently working in extending this demographic diversity result to greater n, and we can narrow down the set of possible patterns, even though the problem with greater N is of course, multidimensional and carries complexities in terms of how you define the demographic diversity in the correct way. And we hope to also soon provide an algorithm for computing the optimal mini-public for any N. Okay, so in the remaining few minutes, let me say a few words about how the optimal mini-public depends on political uncertainty. Now, ex ante, we might have the intuition that greater political uncertainty implies greater agency loss between the citizens and the policymakers. So, of course, we might think that it's harder to motivate evidence discovery, the greater is the political uncertainty. What we show in this paper is that, in fact, political uncertainty has a non-monotonic effect on the optimal mini-public. The curse of too little information that we've identified will disappear if political uncertainty is either too high or too low. So the formal statement here is that for sufficiently low political uncertainty or for sufficiently high political uncertainty, the optimal mini-public will be the first best mini-public. Okay, so it's only for levels of political uncertainty between these two cutoffs that will have a mini-public that's potentially distorted away from the first best. Now, in mathematical terms, the reason for this result is that the minimum level, the payoff minimizing level of informativeness sigma squared under bar moves closer to zero as either tau goes to zero or tau goes to plus infinity. Okay? So I've written here the expression for this payoff minimizing level of informativeness. And as you can see from the second term here, as tau squared goes to zero, this goes to zero. As tau squared goes to plus infinity, this goes to zero as well. That's to say, the minimum is moving further to the left, and it will be very close to zero. So the citizens' payoff is strictly increasing in informativeness in the limit. So any mini-public will be active. In fact, the citizens will be perfectly aligned with the policymaker. So the policymaker can activate the first best mini-public. However, the economic intuition is quite different at each extreme. So when uncertainty is low, the policymaker prefers the same adoption decision as the citizens ex post. So the misalignment vanishes. And that's the reason for the first best mini-public to become active. The citizens will value a more accurate adoption decision in the same way that the policymaker does. So there is no misalignment with low political uncertainty. But with high political uncertainty, things are different. So the citizens indeed are quite misaligned potentially with the policymaker, but they cannot affect the the probability of ex-post misalignment by being passive. In fact, in the limit, the policymaker's decision is entirely unpredictable from the citizen's perspective, and the probability of adoption approaches 1/2. And we show here that the value of information will dominate the motive for misuse of information precisely because the probability of adoption will go to 1/2 much faster than the expectation that the policymaker forms based on the evidence. So the first best mini-public, and in fact all mini-publics, will be active when tau becomes very high as well. Okay, so putting all of these two together, when political uncertainty is moderate, it's in fact the citizens are willing to be passive because two conditions are met. So first, ex-post misalignment is sufficiently likely, which is quite different from the low uncertainty world. And secondly, the citizens can influence substantially the likelihood of ex-post misalignment, which is different from what happens in the high political uncertainty world. So both the citizens are sufficiently misaligned and they can sufficiently change things by bringing evidence forward. Okay. So let me take 1 minute to wrap up, and then I'm happy to answer more questions and go into more details. So in this paper, we are addressing an issue that we believe is central to the literature to the political economy literature on minipublics. OECD, which has started a citizens participation project recently, in one of its recent reports, lists policy impact and representativeness as two desirable features of mini-public design. When they say policy impact, they're thinking about the responsiveness of the commissioning public authority to the recommendations of the mini-public. And by representativeness, they mean that the participants should be a microcosm of the general public. So the OECD report is pointing out that both of these features are important for mini-public design. This paper sheds light on the interaction between these two features. Okay, so we point out in particular that if political uncertainty is either too low or too high, there is no tension. It's precisely when the uncertainty is moderate, which the case in which the citizens might decide to self-select out of the mini-public by not engaging and providing evidence. Okay? In fact, we show that the citizens will engage in evidence discovery only if the background of other mini-public citizens will be sufficiently similar to theirs. And very recently, we were able to find some evidence on this as well. Okay? So the point is that when you cannot guarantee as a policymaker impact to the mini-public citizens, then it will be hard to induce a representative mini-public to be active and to provide evidence. In the paper, we have a number of extensions, so let me quickly list them, and then I'm happy to talk about any of them or anything else. In the baseline model, we have citizens discovering data perfectly or not at all. We have an extension in which we allow for noisy discovery of that data. Secondly, we are currently moving away from the Gaussian structure, or rather extending to other non-Gaussian structures, and we're extending the results to the location scale families of distributions as well. In our baseline model, the citizens perfectly commit to discover publicly their outcome. We have an extension on a disclosure game in which the citizens decide whether to disclose their data after observing it. We also have extensions on delegation of the decision, an ex-ante biased policymaker, and turnover in policymakers. So thank you very much, and sorry for being over time. I'm happy to address questions.
Okay, then let me ask a quick question, just whether I understood it correctly. So if the policymaker could commit to some other threshold, probably he could benefit, right?
So we do believe that the policymaker will be able to establish first best more frequently. We haven't formally worked out this extension, but that's our intuition, that commitment to the right threshold, which we believe is the zero threshold, should make the policymakers strictly better off and reestablish the first best. But that's something that we're currently working on, and we hope to have sort of a firmer answer in a few days.
Okay, if there are no further questions, then we're very good in time. And yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. Yeah, hope to see you soon in person or online.
Hopefully. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks a lot.